Chapter 17 takes a look at the history of the 20th century, sort of into the beginning of the 21st century, with a particular focus on the United States, and tries to use the models that we've learned so far to try to understand what happened in the macroeconomy during those 100 years or so. And so we can see both good policies and institutions that help promote growth. We had very strong growth overall in the century, but we definitely had some periods that were stronger than others. And some of the recessions and slowdowns can be traced to some policy and institutional failures, and we want to understand what those failures were and what policy making lessons we can learn from the past. And we can see that while the Great Depression and the Great Recession had similar causes, the responses were very different and the results were very different as well. So we call these three economic epochs the Great Depression, right? So the Great Depression began in 1929 and sort of continued throughout the 1930s with periods of recovery and recession still. The Golden Age, which sort of started after World War II and went into the mid to late 1970s, and then the financial crisis, which at least before the financial crisis was called the Great Moderation, but ended in the financial crisis of 2008. And so we're going to try to learn what we can from these three periods and note their similarities and differences. So if we look at the Great Depression and the Great Recession, we can see that global industrial production fell by a similar amount in both periods. So we set the industrial production at 100 at the beginning of both of these crises, and you can see that after a year they have both dropped by more than 10%. But in the Great Depression, production continued to fall, right? And it fell for 3.5 years before starting to recover some more, but then there was another recession in 1937. In the Great Recession, recovery started to recover, industrial production started to recover in about 2009 and recovered fairly steadily after that. And so that's a big difference. And the question is, well, what did we do differently, both in the United States and in other countries? One hint is looking at interest rates, right? And so one of the big differences between the Great Depression and the Great Recession was that interest rates were typically still pretty high in the Great Depression, right? They were above 3%. This is a 7-country average, so it's not just the United States. Whereas in the Great Recession, interest rates were dropped almost all the way to zero and stayed there for a very long time, really led by the Federal Reserve. Ben Bernanke, who was the chair of the Fed at the time, was a student of the Great Depression, and so was probably a great person to have as the chair of the Fed when the recession hit. Another policy difference was the change in the budget balance. So remember that during a recession, taxes tend to go down and spending tends to go up, creating a recession, creating a deficit. Those deficits were relatively small in the 1930s, but were very large sort of in 2009, 2010. That was especially true in the United States. The budget deficit hit about 10% of GDP in 2009, 2010. And so that was a strong fiscal response compared to the Great Depression. Another thing that we can look at is sort of the unemployment rate over time. So this shows the unemployment rate in the United States for 100 years along with productivity growth. So you can see the unemployment rate hit 25% at the height of the Great Depression, whereas it only hit about 10% at the height of the Great Recession. Productivity growth was very strong in the post-World War II years, but it was also pretty strong sort of after the initial fall in the Great Depression. And then we had this period that was called the Great Moderation for a while. Productivity growth was pretty good, but not great, but the unemployment rate was pretty low. If we look at the income share of the top 1%, you can see it was high in the 1920s and early 1930s. It fell by a lot, by more than half, so it went from 16 to 20% down to about 8% before climbing back up to about 20%. And so one of the questions that we want to think about, although I don't think there's a definitive answer, is whether or not these variables are related, right? Is the share of income going to that top 1% somehow causing financial crises like the Great Depression and the Great Recession? There's a lot of research going on in that area, but I don't think there's yet a definitive answer. If we look at profit taxes and profitability over the same period, so here we start in 1927, we can see that the pre-tax profit rate, this orange line, was very high in the 50s and 60s when we had that really strong growth. But taxes on profits, which is the difference between the orange line and the green line, which is graphed down here as the purple line, were also much higher. And then profits, pre-tax profits started to fall, but so did taxes, and so post-tax profits, our green line here, stayed about the same. And so there's one question is, how are those two related? What does that have to do with investment? What does that have to do with productivity growth? And so we'll explore that as we look at the history over the last 100 years. Another big change that's happened sort of since the golden epoch is an increase in debt. Partially that's an increase in government debt, although not as much. It's also partially, but not completely, an increase in non-financial business sector debt. It's more an increase in household debt. So households took on more debt, both for mortgages, for credit cards, for student loans. And then especially the financial sector experienced a big increase in debt. And remember that when financial sectors have a lot of debt, they do that because it increases their leverage and can increase their profits when times are good, but then it can also put the financial sector in a much riskier position, as we saw with the Great Recession. We're going to look mostly at the United States, but we want to also think about what's going on in the rest of the world. So if we think about the Great Depression, in the US, it was actually worse than in the UK. They avoided a banking crisis, perhaps because they had some more experiences with banking crises in the 19th century. And it wasn't really until, of course, World War II came that the US was really pulled out of the Great Depression. And obviously, Europe experienced World War II in a much starker way because the war was fought on their soil. In the Golden Age, the U.S. was really the technology leader. So, and they also, in the late 40s and early 50s, had an economy that was largely intact from the war, right? Whereas Europe was still rebuilding, Japan was still rebuilding. And so outside the US, as these countries rebuilt and as they adopted the latest technology from the United States, that allowed them to catch up, grow faster than the United States until they were more on an equal level. In the financial crisis, the US experienced a significant housing bubble, which was fueled by debt, people borrowing to buy houses, and then that debt turning bad when the housing bubble popped. Other countries did not experience a housing bubble. Some did. So Spain experienced a housing bubble, Portugal to some extent, France to some extent, but not as much. But other countries did not experience a bubble and largely avoided the financial crisis. Interestingly, Texas actually had much less of a housing bubble than a lot of states because they had put in regulations in the 1980s and early 1990s because of their own regional housing bubble that had helped fuel the savings and loan crisis of that time. And so international openness, so the trade between countries, is generally more important for most other countries than in the US. The US is a very large economy. Imports and exports are between 12 and 18% of GDP. But for other countries, it can be as high as 80% of GDP. Most of what they produce gets exported, and most of what they buy is imported. So we'll talk about the United States, but we also want to think about what was going on in those other